Good morning and welcome to Scientist to Go. My name is Wynne and I'm an educator at the Gulf of Maine Research Institute. Today we are going to be listening to Molly give a presentation. She's going to do a 20 to 25 minute presentation and then we'll move on to the question and answer session. So we ask that you guys please go ahead and post any questions that you have while she's talking, and then we'll wait to address it at the end. If you have any questions or any technical difficulties, please also let me know that in the chat. And I ask that you send them directly to me. My name says Aowen on the list of people you can email or you can message. And without further ado, I'm going to pass it on to Molly.
Yeah, good afternoon. It's so good to be here today. I'm going to just take a moment and share my screen. And we'll go ahead and get started. Here we go. So my name is Molly Payne Wynne. I'm the Freshwater Program Director with the Nature Conservancy in Maine. I live in Woolwich with my husband and my kindergartner and my Australian cattle dog. And this presentation, I'm going to talk to you about my work restoring waterways in Maine. And I think the timing of this presentation is so great because it is my favorite time of year. And hopefully you'll figure out why once I go through the talk. So be paying attention. Before I launch, I was really curious to hear if anybody knew of what a sea run fish was, because we have a lot of them here in Maine. So Eowyn, I'm not sure if we had any responses in the chat.
We had one person, they said they know about salmon.
Oh, cool. Okay, great. So favorite time of year is because fish are running in our rivers right now, which is super exciting. And we actually have a lot of sea run fish here in Maine, and their sort of existence is directly related to the work that I do day to day and thinking about how to restore and maintain those fisheries. So we have in Maine, we actually have 12 native species of sea run fish. And they, you can see on this map, all of the different colors indicate the different ranges for each of those fish species. So you can see it's almost the entire coast of Maine. All of the coastal rivers, for the most part, have at least one or two of the species of fish. Many have all of them. And this time of year in the spring tends to be when these fish are coming into our rivers from the ocean. So sea run means that these fish are migratory. Another word for sea run is diadromous. So diadromous species of fish require multiple habitats to complete their life cycle. So these fish spend part of their life cycle in the marine environment, and then they swim into the freshwater environment in our rivers and streams to reproduce or to live out their lives in the case of the American eel, and then they move back out to those other habitats. So we have here in Maine, we have striped bass, we have short-nosed and Atlantic sturgeon, we have rainbow smelt, we have Atlantic tomcod, we have brook trout, blueback herring, alewives, Atlantic salmon that somebody already mentioned, which is great. My favorite is the American eel because they're long and slimy and slippery, and they move in the opposite direction of the rest of the sea run fish. So they actually spend their lives in our freshwater lakes, rivers, and streams, and then they move out to the marine environment past the Gulf of Maine in the Sargasso Sea to reproduce. So really cool fish. I could talk a really long time about sea run fish. So before I get too carried away, I want to tell you a little bit about myself and who I am and how I ended up here working in Maine on fish restoration. And then I'll tell you a little bit about sort of what I do as a scientist. So I grew up in upstate New York near the Adirondacks, and I spent a lot of time in and around the water. A big fishing family, so I was out a lot. And just sort of grew up loving being outside and being on and in the water. And so when it came time to graduate high school and think about what I wanted to do next in terms of my education and my career, I was really thinking about a career in some sort of environmental science, and didn't really know exactly what I wanted that to be. I had always been really intrigued by the ocean, and I think maybe that's because I grew up so inland that I never really went to the ocean very often, and it was really intriguing to me. So I ended up going to school at the State University of New York College of Environmental Science and Forestry, and I pursued a degree in environmental college. I was sort of learning about lots of different things, lots of different animals, different ecosystems, different habitat types. And for whatever reason, I kept going back to fish. And I was so captivated by fish and sort of their role in the environment and in our natural world. And so after school, during school, I kind of explored lots of different opportunities and experiences related to fish and fisheries and freshwater and marine systems. So I did volunteer work in Yellowstone National Park, working on native trout. I worked on a research project in the Colorado River in the bottom of the Grand Canyon on an endangered fish species there. I spent a little bit of time in graduate school learning about marine fisheries in Iceland. Sort of being in all of these different places and thinking about where did I actually want to be to spend my life and my career. And ultimately, I ended up back here in Maine, and I worked on the Penobscot River Restoration Project. So it's New England's largest river, and that has sort of satiated my appetite to sort of be working with fish and learning about fish, and in particular in sea run and migratory fish restoration. And what was really important to me, sort of in both school and kind of learning all of the basics about scientific research and fisheries research, was how scientists take that research and information and data and measurements that we're getting in the field, and how do we think about applying that to restoration, or thinking about how do we make the fish populations healthier and longer lasting and sustainable. So I really liked thinking about getting information in the field and then using it to inform actions that we as humans are doing to restore and protect these really important habitats for fish and other wildlife. And when we think about Maine, Maine is a really important and really cool place. And so when we think about climate change and how climate is impacting our natural world, Maine actually stands out as a place where we have really healthy, diverse freshwater systems overall. And we have a lot of forest in Maine, which means that we have really good water quality. We have all 12 of the native species of sea run fish that I mentioned. So they all still live here. They still exist in some numbers along our coastline. Maine is actually the best place to restore and maintain eastern brook trout populations, so another fishery, compared to a lot of other places that you can see on the map. So Maine is in the red box there. Maine actually has really diverse geology, and relatively speaking, we have long stream segments and we have fewer dams that block fish movement than other parts of the East Coast on the United States. So Maine is actually a really fascinating place to work. And when we're thinking about climate change, it's really important that we're restoring and protecting the ecosystems in Maine, because they play a really, really critical role for mitigating and adapting to climate change from an ecological perspective. So when I talk about work on river systems and restoring Maine's waterways, what that actually means is that we are focused on ensuring that these rivers and streams in our state and elsewhere are connected. So the length of the stream is connected to itself. The freshwater system is actually connected to the riparian system, so along the stream banks. And then those ecosystems and habitat types are actually still connected to the terrestrial or the land-based ecosystems near them. And so just like people, healthy streams are actually more resilient to the impacts of or harms caused by climate change. So when we have healthy rivers and streams, they're able to adapt better to a lot of the stressors that are being brought about by a changing climate. So my work really primarily focuses on the fact that rivers and streams function best when they're connected and they're allowed to sort of flow as nature intended, flow naturally. And that simultaneously benefits all of the fish and the critters and the people that depend on these systems to live. Whoops. So what that looks like in practice, thinking about how do we remove barriers in these systems so that they can flow freely and that animals like fish, especially sea-run fish, which need to get to those important habitats in river, are able to access them. So the pictures that you see on the screen in the bottom right-hand corner is actually a former main stem dam on the Penobscot River. So that's the largest river in Maine. It runs up through the city of Bangor, if you're familiar with where Bangor is. And the project that I worked on actually removed this dam in 2013. So you can see the construction equipment actually pulling the dam out of the river. And then the big image on the left is showing what the river looks like today. So that section of river is now equal to what the free-flowing sections are above and below from a fish perspective. And so we've reconnected this main transportation way, if you will, for fish and other aquatic wildlife. So it's not just dam removals, it can be lots of other things, lots of other methods to reconnect streams and rivers. This example is also part of the Penobscot River Restoration Project, and this is a nature-like fishway. So you can kind of see that how the river sort of horseshoes around the dam in the picture. So that horseshoe has specifically been engineered to mimic a natural stream, a natural river system. And so the fish can actually swim around the dam up through that channel and make their way upriver to where they need to be in the critical habitat. So that's a nature-like fishway or a bypass channel is what that type of restoration is called. One thing that collectively, and also me personally, have learned about sort of working on these kind of bigger restoration projects is how important it is to document the changes that are happening in the environment because of the actions that we're taking to restore these systems. So thinking about what did the river look like and function like before we took the dam out, and then comparing that to after. And because we really want to see whether or not what we're doing is helping the system, is helping the fish. And so we look at things like the projects I've been involved in, look at things like the actual structure of the river channel itself, the water quality and the sort of chemical components of the water itself, looking at the vegetation and the trees and the plants along the shoreline. And then, of course, looking at the fish, like how are they behaving? Are they moving up through that bypass channel, for example? Are the types of fish that are in the river different now that we have the ability for the fish from the ocean, the sea-run fish, being able to move up through the river? What does that look like for the biodiversity or the fish community in the river as well? And then how are these actions sort of impacting food web dynamics? So are there more eagles? Are there more osprey? Are there more otter because we're introducing more numbers of native fish into the system? So one other sort of interesting element of the work is that it's not just the big main stem dams and main stem rivers that are connected to the ocean, But what we found is that's what's really important too, is thinking about all of these little networks of the rivers and streams that we as humans drive over, we walk over, probably every day. If you got in your car today at all and you took a ride, you probably drove over several streams or rivers in your driving. And so what happens is we as humans, we build roads over streams and we need a way for the water to get through. And so typically in the past, we have sort of stuck culverts or we've stuck pipes in that allow the water to run under the road. But what that does is it actually creates these really big barriers for fish and other wildlife to move up through. So if you look at the bottom right-hand picture where that person is sitting up on the road, there's a big culvert below. If you can imagine yourself as a tiny little brook trout in that stream, and you need to get to the other side, there's no way that you would be able to jump up a 3-foot jump into a pipe that probably only has about an inch of water running through it. And so these are really big barriers for these fish. And when they happen all over the landscape, it actually has a really big impact. So one of the ways that we think about this is we go out in the field and we look at individual crossings and we take a series of measurements so that we can understand at each crossing, what are the site conditions? Is it a barrier to fish? Is it not? You know, what does the stream channel look like? And then we take all of that information. We've collected it over the course of about 13 years, and we put it into this giant database that we have so that we can really understand where are the places that these barriers exist and what impacts do they have on the habitat that fish and other species need. So we in Maine actually have one of, if not the largest database of information related to road stream crossings in the entire world. It's pretty phenomenal. And like I said, it took us about 13 years of sending stream crews out every summer and driving around the state and measuring these crossings. We put them into a database online. And then we're able to take that information and we're able to layer it with other information about Atlantic salmon, for example, or brook trout. And we can essentially decide where there's 26,000 plus road crossings in Maine. Where are the places that we can work to do restoration that'll have the most benefit for the freshwater ecosystems and the species that depend on them? So it kind of allows us to go from this massive problem of 26,000 crossings all over the state to start to narrow it in to think about where can we do work that has the most impact. So what that typically looks like is that we would take the data that we collected in the field, we put it into the database, we identify a specific barrier where there's an opportunity for a restoration. So you'll see number one, again, imagine you're a little baby brook trout. There's no way you're jumping up into that pipe. Then we work with folks on the ground to implement construction, and we take the actual barrier out, and then we replace it. You'll see number three with ideally something that is essentially as close to a bridge as possible, because you'll see underneath that structure in this picture, the stream's actually able to flow through really naturally. And you could imagine, okay, if you're a little brook trout, you could swim up through that very easily because there's lots of water and it's functioning just the same as the rest of the stream would. You could also move up through that culvert or bridge if you were a raccoon or a black bear or a turtle that didn't want to get hit by a car on the road. So it's also, these crossings are also really important for not just fish, but for wildlife as well. So number four is that you win and you get to swim up through that nice little bridge. So yeah, just to reiterate, I love fish, but it's not just about the fish. There's so many other benefits to this work, thinking about birds and otters and turtles and the insects that live in the water and near the water. There's a lot of benefit to the whole ecosystem and not just single species. So that's also really cool about this work. And on top of, it's not just the fish, it's also about the people too. So these projects where we're having impacts on restoring biodiversity, so the numbers of species that are in these ecosystems and in these habitats are also really great for us as humans too. We're able to enjoy the healthy rivers and streams and lakes. We can fish in them when there's great fish populations. They're inspiring for things like art and music creation, and they have a lot of significance for Indigenous communities, the Wabanaki people that are here in the state, who have long relied on these systems for a very long time. There are direct connections to the restoration of sea-run fish and our local economies and fishing communities. In particular, thinking about the connection of sort of this work to the Gulf of Maine fisheries is that river herring, as an example, so alewife or blueback herring that are coming up our rivers any minute now, probably in the next few days, they'll start to run from the ocean up our rivers, and they are in Maine, actually, is the only state left on the eastern seaboard that allows a sustainable harvest of these fish. And so they will start to come up the rivers by the millions, and at certain locations they'll be harvested like you see in this picture. These fish are actually a prized lobster bait. So these fishermen fishing for alewife will sell them to lobster fishermen, excuse me, and they'll use them for bait to catch lobster. And the little babies that are coming out of the system, so these fish are moving into ponds to spawn, and then their young will move out to the ocean and actually act as a food source for lots of animals like birds or other marine fisheries in the Gulf of Maine. So it's all about connectivity. It's all about keeping the ecosystems connected, keeping the habitats connected so that the fish can move up through. So I'll tell one little story about Blackman Stream, and that is a tributary to the Penobscot River that I talked about earlier, where those big dams were taken out and the bypass was created around the one. So this is a stream off of that main stem river. And before the dams came out, there were essentially no alewives in this stream because all of the passage was blocked. The connections to the ocean were not there. So the dam removals happened and a fishway was built. You can see in this picture where there's sort of these like little steps up the river to move the fish up through. The fish started coming back in really big numbers. So the first year after, there were almost 200,000 fish in this tiny little stream. In 2018, there were 540,000 fish. And just last year, there were well over 600,000 fish moving up through this stream. And this is a place where you can actually walk on the banks and just about dip your hands in and pull the fish out. They're that close. And it's such a small stream. So it's an incredible success story. And one of the reasons why this work is so joyful for me to do is that it's instant. These fish are waiting to get back to their habitat. They know where they need to go. And in many cases, the moment we take the barrier out, they are knocking at the door, ready to swim up into where they need to be. And that's so rare in environmental restoration work that you can see impacts immediately like that. So it's really cool. And just to share that there are so many places in Maine that you can actually go and see this for yourself. So there's a link, mainrivers.org. Maybe AON can put that in the chat if you want to visit. There's a map where you can go see the river herring runs this spring. So again, in like a week or so, they're going to start and then they'll go through mid-June. And then one other quick element is that working with the Nature Conservancy, which is a global organization, we have offices all around the world. One of the other joys of my job is that I get to connect the work that we do here in Maine to fisheries and river restoration across the globe. And so we're part of what's called the World Fish Migration Foundation and World Fish Migration Day. And so we get to share the lessons that we're learning in Maine, and we get to hear from people all over the globe in terms of how they're doing river restoration and how they're restoring migratory fish runs. So this is a cool illustration of the world and how there are migratory fish all over the planet. And there are a lot of similarities to what we have in Maine, and there are a lot of differences. And it's really cool to be able to plug into such an awesome network of folks. Last but not least, I'll just share and then I'll open to questions. My job in particular, I started in a very research focus. So I was doing a lot of lab work and field work. And now my job is sort of evolved into more restoration and management based. And so some days I'm actually out in the field, like you see in this picture, helping with, this is Department of Marine Resources was doing Atlantic salmon egg planting. So I got to help with that. Other days I am behind a computer doing data analysis, and others I am in meetings on phone calls with folks from the Wabanaki tribes, from Department of Marine Resources, Inland Fish and Wildlife, Maine Audubon. This work is massively collaborative. So there's many, many people and many, many partners that work to make all of this happen. So with that, I'll stop talking and hear if you all have any questions for me.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Molly. We already have a few questions about salmon.
Yeah.
How big can salmon get and what colors are they?
Oh my gosh, great questions. Salmon can actually get to be about 1 meter long. And they're mostly silver. Atlantic salmon are mostly silver. On the West Coast, there are species of salmon that are like those bright red salmon or pink salmon. But in Maine, they're Atlantic salmon and they're very silvery.
Okay. Are people allowed to fish for those?
You can fish for salmon in Maine, although you are not allowed to fish for the searum salmon or the native Atlantic salmon, because they are listed as endangered. Their populations are so low, and that's why we're working so hard to restore their habitat. There are landlocked salmon in Maine where you can go and fish for them, and they look and they act really similar, but they don't actually migrate all the way out to the ocean. They stay in the lake habitat where they live.
Is that by choice or by they're forced to do that?
By choice.
Okay.
And yeah, so they're slightly different populations, but essentially they look and seem very similar. But so you can fish for landlocked salmon, but you can't fish for the endangered Atlantics.
Cool. How does the planting of salmon eggs work?
Good question. So salmon eggs are planted in places where we know that the fish would naturally be spawning and reproducing. You take essentially a pump, a water pump, and you use that to pull water directly from the river, and you get a giant metal funnel. And so you put the funnel in the river, it's about 3 foot tall, and you put a hose from the pump that you're pulling the river water directly from, and you essentially create a little nest in the riverbed. So you're mimicking what the salmon would do on its own. And then you take the eggs that you see in the, well, I don't have it on the screen anymore, the eggs that were in the picture, and you dump them in the funnel, and they settle down into the fine gravel that you've just sort of made this little nest. And then you carefully take the funnel out, and the bigger rocks kind of fold over the eggs, and then they stay there until they're ready to hatch.
That's really cool. I like to hear that. You had a picture with little steps. How does the steps help the fish get up?
Great question. So that is essentially what we call a fish ladder. There's many different sort of methods for moving fish or creating fishways. The steps in the picture actually sort of create a series of pools, and they slowly go uphill. So they're up the gradient. So you can imagine you're sort of building like a little series of step pools. so that the fish can get from the lower river where it enters to the higher part of the river where like a head pond would be, or where the bulk of the habitat would be. So they kind of swim up through, and then they have those little steps where they can kind of take a rest and then build up energy to move up to the next one, because it takes a lot of energy to move against the current the whole way up.
Cool. How long do those pipe restorations or like the bridge restorations you were talking about where the fish can't get up? How long does that project take?
Typically those size projects can be done in a couple of months. So there's actually a pretty narrow amount of time called a work window, where it's timed, especially when we're working in places where there are Atlantic salmon. We can only start working late in the summer when we know the fish aren't going to be where we're working. And so that's essentially July. And then we want to wrap up before the winter. So it's July through November. So they're typically done in a couple of months. But the bigger ones, like the dam removals, take many years. Those are typically like at least a 3-year process.
How do you decide if it's time to do a dam removal?
Oh, that's a really great question. That also takes a lot of time to think about reasons why you would want to take a dam out. If you can physically do it is another question. So sometimes the site just won't allow for that dam to be removed. And then you have to sort of build support for that in a community where often the dams are part of sort of a downtown, or they're really centrally located, because where dams tend to have been constructed in Maine was along places where they needed to have power. They needed to use them for mills. And so there's lots of different factors that go into determining whether or not you would want to remove a dam versus put in some other type of fish passage.
What kinds of impacts do you have to worry about when you remove a dam?
Well, that's a really good question. Well, I guess a lot of the impacts tend to look at the hydrology, or the way that the water is going to move through that area if you take the dam out. So often there will be water that is backed up behind a dam because it's essentially slowing the flow of water through that stretch. So it'll create what's called a head pond above the dam. And so a lot of the considerations are around water flow. And if you take the dam out, what does the river then look like? What does it function like? And in some cases, it can actually be really good, because if the flow of the river is allowed to sort of act more naturally through a stretch, it often can reduce flooding around places where there were dams in place. So that's kind of the biggest consideration in terms of like, can you do it? On top of the reasons of why you would want to do it.
Do you have like a big gush of water like they do in the movies when a dam breaks?
Sometimes, but they're pretty well controlled. But there are videos online of places out west on the West Coast where they'll actually use dynamite and they'll blow up dams, which is pretty cool to look at. But it tends to be much more carefully executed here, because in Maine, we've built communities very much along the sides of the rivers, like I said. So the dams tend to be in places that are really centrally located. So we have to be really careful and engineer different phases of taking them out.
Okay. And you were talking about the bypasses as well. How do the fish know to go on the bypass instead of like getting stuck at the dam?
So one of the things that fish sort of focus on when they're moving upstream is flow. So they know and they can sense that they have to have a certain flow to be able to move up through a space. So when the water is kind of rushing down through, either a fishway or it's coming over a dam, we call it attraction flow. So there's certain levels of velocity of that flow that'll actually attract the fish to where they need to be. So in essence, the flow coming through the bypass would be much more attractive to the fish, and they would know that they could navigate that, versus where it may not even be flowing, or where it may be coming out way too fast that they're not going to be able to go up through.
Fascinating. How is the health and cleanliness of Maine's river and stream waterways and their impacts on the sea run fish?
Oh my gosh, these are awesome questions. So water quality is really important. And we have seen significant improvements in water quality since the 1970s and the Clean Water Act, which basically says you can't just dump pollution into rivers, right? And so over that time frame, we've seen really drastic improvements across our nation around water quality. Maine tends to have really good water quality because we have so much forested landscape that helps sort of filter a lot of the water that's coming down through. Another piece is that water temperature is also really important, especially for Atlantic salmon and brook trout. And so cooler waters tend to maintain better water quality than warmer waters. And the cooler waters, the cold waters, are really important for those fish species. They need that really clean, cold water in order to be able to thrive.
Cool, thank you. Thinking back a little bit, what did you want to be when you were little? And then how did you decide you wanted to become a scientist?
I wanted to be a marine biologist, as many young girls do. That was my goal. And I mentioned that I grew up in upstate New York, which I was very far from the ocean and anything marine. And that was what I had my sights set on. But then I sort of, I guess, being in the outdoors a lot and sort of growing to love those places that were really wild and remote and natural, I wanted to be in a job that would let me that would allow me to sort of help maintain that for other people growing up so that they would have a similar experience. So yeah, and then scientists just felt like a really natural way to do that. Like, how do you learn about a place so that you can then protect it, or conserve it, or have a better relationship with it? Science felt like a really great way to do that.
Yeah, thank you. How many salmon are in New England?
Oh my gosh, I don't know the answer to that question.
A lot?
We could easily find out how many salmon are migrating into rivers in Maine, because there are a lot of places where there's actually fish counts. So if you remember, the first image on my slideshow was the picture of a salmon, and there was like a sea lamprey in that picture sort of swimming underwater. That was actually at a fish count. So at certain dams, the fish have to move up through a fish ladder, and we can actually count the number of fish that are coming up through. So we have a good idea of salmon annually per river, but I haven't actually ever added it all up. So it's a great question, and I don't know the answer, but I will say we have significantly less salmon and less fish than the state has seen historically. So they used to number in the millions, and now we're in sort of like the thousands, sometimes high hundreds for a lot of these fish. So that's what's really important about restoring them, is like we're bringing them back to what were really high numbers of fish.
Okay. What about the other anadromous species? Are they also lower in numbers, or are some of them still at normal numbers?
So all of the fish are pretty low numbers based on historic estimates that we have. Like I said, many of those fish species would have numbered in the millions annually. River herring, for example, so the alewife and blueback herring that I mentioned, and that tributary where they came back the numbers really, really quickly, they're actually doing really pretty well. Like the numbers are climbing every year, and every time we're sort of doing these restoration projects, it's kind of an instant bump up in the numbers. So sorry, I kind of forgot what the actual question was. I was focused on the river herring numbers.
No, that's okay.
The other fish species, yeah. So, and the other species we're counting as well, but there's only certain places that we're counting. So there are scientists that are out doing population estimates of those species, and they've been pretty consistent over the past several years. But I think in general, they are climbing because we're doing these restoration projects in the state.
Yay, that's good to hear. Okay, so now as we wrap up, I have a couple of questions. What would you say is the hardest part of your job?
The hardest part of my job is that I get pulled in a lot of different directions all the time. So it's busy. It's really busy. And especially right now, we have a lot of money coming from the federal government that's actually helping us do these restoration projects. And with that additional support, we're doing a lot more of them. And so it's just super busy that we have lots of projects coming online and they're all happening around the same time. So I think that's the hardest part, is that there tends to be so much work that we need many, many more of me and other people in jobs like mine to be able to do it all.
That's cool. So it sounds like that's an opportunity for more people to join your field.
Absolutely.
Excellent. What is your favorite part of your job?
Oh, I have so many. My favorite part of my job, I will say one of the favorite parts, is when I get to go out with colleagues in the field. So the picture I showed on the last slide was going out with Department of Marine Resources and Atlantic Salmon Federation colleagues. Just being able to be in the river that you're working to restore and having hands-on salmon eggs that you're hoping will come back someday and make more eggs of their own. That is absolutely one of the highlights of the job, is being able to be outdoors and with colleagues who have similar passion for restoring these systems.
It does sound like a pretty incredible experience. Now I want to go plant some salmon eggs.
It's really cool. It's really cool.
All right. And my final question, what are you most excited about in your field right now?
Well, I kind of touched on this a little bit. There is so much opportunity for restoration work right now. And we're seeing that the work that we're doing is actually having really awesome benefits for the ecosystems and the fish that we're trying to restore. And so there's only going to be sort of more of these projects in the future. And I'm super excited to see kind of where we're at as a state 5 to 10 years from now, because we're building momentum and now we're in an opportunity where we're really seeing the results of it, and it's really great.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much, Molly. I am going to turn off the recording now.